taking it. So as you know, we've been discussing this path dependency approach, and the focus on critical junctures ties closely to really the heart of the approach, which focuses on these critical historical moments that lift constraints on action and make it possible to bring about wholesale change or radical change. Now, those critical moments are juxtaposed with those moments of path dependency that stretch for long periods of time, where the path that's chosen at that critical moment is reproduced and sort of adhered to over the long term. Now, this approach, it has us focusing on the circumstances during that critical juncture, and specifically on the critical junctures that countries experience. And remember that the approach really involves going back to that last historical moment and finding out what was taking place at that time. What was the nature of the power relations? What were the dominant ideas at that time? Now, those moments in the power relations and the ideas that kind of characterize those moments then give way to those long periods of sort of gestation and consolidation, where those power relations and those ideas are kind of solidified and reproduced, creating momentum. Now, this approach, it's useful because it makes us think about time and temporality in ways that the other approaches don't. So remember that the historical and cultural approach is really a static theory, even though it goes all the way back to the beginning of the colonial era. It kind of reads everything since then out of that moment in time. And it's insensitive to the possibility that time and duration can become factors that can change the course or that can alter the original trajectory. Now, for the same reason, it explains stability really, really well, the path dependency approach. It does a good job helping to clarify why systems tend to be reproduced over the long term. We know that the emphasis on positive feedback and increasing returns is what does the work there. We know that there are different sources of such feedback and increasing returns, and that stability that we observe can be largely understood through the lens of those different concepts. But these strengths come at some pretty serious weaknesses. So first and foremost, it explains stability well, but it explains change very poorly. And the reason I say poorly is because the theory itself doesn't really contain any actual causes. A critical juncture by itself does not cause anything. It's what takes place during that critical juncture. It's the power relations and the ideas. Critical juncture is sort of like an empty concept from that point of view. The critical juncture may be essential to creating an opportunity, but the actual work is done by the actors in the ideas and the power relations who fill the void. And so it's not possible to really explore, and explain change when you don't have a theory that contains a theory of change. And for the same reason, the theory doesn't really have much predictive power. The causal factors that we identify in retrospect are always specific. They're always contextual. For the same reason that the notion of a critical juncture is really categorical, the causes that fill that critical juncture are really sort of amorphous and not specified. Those power relations are always different from time period to time period and from country to country. They're always contextual. And so the theory, in addition to explaining change poorly, because it doesn't have a theory of change, it doesn't actually let us predict much at all, because the circumstances that do the work are always particular to that specific case. And then finally, there's the weakness that comes from the fact that there's no distinction between institutions that are more and less vulnerable to change. So are all institutions equally vulnerable, or are some more vulnerable than others? And what implications does that carry for political action? And are political actors capable of distinguishing between those institutions that are more and less vulnerable to change? And do they devise and create strategies based upon that knowledge? All of this is lost on the theory. And so it does have some problems. It does have some limits. And I'm going to just summarize them for you here the same way we did with the historical and cultural approach. And that summary has us again thinking about the role of power relations and ideas at the last critical juncture in a state, and how those power relations and ideas at that critical moment explain the political outcomes in that modern day state, in the contemporary period in that state. And so we might be looking at a critical juncture that was 30 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 5 months ago. It just depends on when that last event was, which gave rise to that long period of uninterrupted institutional development from the point of view of the theory. So this theory has us thinking about modern nation states, contemporary states, what's happening there now. And remember that it really is those power relations and those ideas at that most recent critical juncture that do the work. But those instruments are not well specified or really specified at all. And so what this means then is that those are context specific, and they differ from country to country and period to period. And so the critical juncture concept helps us, but it doesn't go much further than drawing our attention to the period of time when change is expected to occur. But what produces that change is not the critical juncture itself. It's the actors in the structures that they assemble or alter during that moment in time. And this is the sort of blind spot in the theory that leads to the main limitation, which is that it's underspecified and doesn't have predictive power. It doesn't let us actually predict what will happen ahead of time. And really, we can only look in retrospect at what took place in the specific timing of that sequence of events and how that timing became important in addition to the circumstances themselves. And so the path dependency approach has some real strengths. It makes us think about, for instance, COVID-19 and whether this is a critical historical moment and what some of the consequences might be. But notice that the path dependency approach doesn't let us think about the COVID-19 pandemic in any more tactile a way. What are the power relations that are going to matter? Well, from what we just discussed with our current event, there probably will be a role for the balance of power between traditional parties and outsider parties or outsider candidates, or those parties who challenge the status quo or emerge sort of on the boundaries to try to peel away seats from some of those established power brokers. It's going to be the balance of power between those outsider and insider parties. But the path dependency approach doesn't tell us anything about that. And it doesn't tell us anything about the specific circumstances in Latin America. It doesn't tell us, for example, that in a country like Peru, there are more than a dozen political parties that already exist, and that further fragmentation could be ruinous. It doesn't tell us, for example, that in a country like Chile, there is profound dissatisfaction among working class people who themselves feel let down by leftist parties. These are nuances and intricacies that aren't captured by the approach. But one of the advantages of the approach is that it does draw attention to the peculiar events that take place in a country. And that is something that distinguishes it from the historical and cultural approach, where we look at regions within the Americas more generally. Now, we've addressed some strengths and some weaknesses of this approach, but there's so much more here. And I'd like to open it up to you. Think about what you would use this to explain, or what this might be useful for as a model or as an approach to Latin American politics. And you can use the mic or the chat.
I feel like conversely to the historical and cultural approach, there's almost no ability to figure out what anything is a critical juncture at the time. So you couldn't use this to like analyze something other than a very specific time period and set of countries, which it would be useful for. But other than like that sort of setup, it doesn't really apply to any other analysis type.
Yeah. So, John is making a similar point, which is that, look, we're assuming that there will be a critical juncture. And what if there isn't a critical juncture? Does that mean that there's never any change? The proponents of the theory might say, well, yeah, it does. But we could just as easily say, well, do those critical junctures themselves occur because the institutions dysfunction internally and they stop working? What is it that helps to bring about those critical junctures that are so important? And then to Ishan's point, even if they do happen, which they might not, which John points out, how do we know one when we see it? And how do we know that we're in it when it's not too late? And it raises an important question, which is, do the actors who act during these critical junctures, do they themselves recognize that they are critical junctures? In other words, if you went to them and you asked, did you know that the normal constraints on action were lifted at this time, and therefore you were behaving in such and such a way as to bring about this outcome because you knew it would be more easily brought about? They might not know. They may not be thinking about it in that way. On the other hand, maybe they're responding to, for example, the collapse of the party system and the corresponding economic crisis that helped to bring it about in a place like Peru or Venezuela. And you might say, well, that they certainly recognize that there was a moment of opportunity and an opening that was created by that series of events that came together at that time. It's difficult to know what a critical juncture is and is not. Is COVID-19 a critical juncture in Latin America? As I said when I discussed the example, it isn't really clear. We have to kind of wait and see. And here's another question. Is it still a critical juncture even if the institutions are not redone and sort of reset at that moment? Can the moment or the opportunity be lost? If you don't lose it, if you don't use it, do you lose it, so to speak? Is it only a critical juncture if the tree falls in the woods and it makes a sound? You know, these kinds of questions. Aditya, intricacies are like the nuances or the particular characteristics of something. So the path dependency approach gives us a tool for understanding when and how outcomes might be brought about and the way that patterns of development unfold in the way that systems develop. But it might not be useful enough if it's not more specific and if it doesn't, for example, tell us about what kinds of power relations matter or what kinds of institutions are liable to be changed and not changed. But I want you to be open to a possibility that we haven't considered, which is that, well, it might be better at studying diversity in Latin America. And I think I've already given away what I want to ask you. But the question I wanted to pose to you is, let's say we begin with that original problem, which is, this is a staggeringly diverse place. How do we study diversity across space and across time in Latin America? And remember that one way that we do that is by using the comparative method. The comparative method accommodates the study of diversity because it isolates on patterns of similarity and difference. and helps us to control for similarities and differences. And it lets us identify factors that can explain outcomes in Latin America in doing so. But we also have talked about how theories and theoretical approaches themselves might be more or less conducive to studying diversity. And so I want to ask you, based upon what we've read about and studied so far, if you wanted to study variation from country to country within Latin America, as opposed to within the Americas, which approach would be best suited to that? And why would it be best suited to that? Think back about what we said about the historical and cultural approach. And remember how we talked about how there's quite a bit of diversity in Latin America with regard to colonial foundations, how extensively those countries were colonized, in terms of the economic policy imposed under colonialism. And remember how we talked about how the historical and cultural approach is not sensitive to a lot of that variation because it treats Latin American countries as having the same experience. And it treats them all as having essentially the same founding conditions or principles. Now, is the path dependency approach better than the historical and cultural approach when it comes to acknowledging and dealing with all of that variation? But John, doesn't the concept of a critical juncture at least open up the possibility that countries can have a variety of different circumstances that might combine in unique ways? Maybe. Okay. Well, I just told you that it's not very specific in that it doesn't contain the analytical tools that we would really need to explain outcomes. And so maybe I primed you to be dismissive of the theory, but what I want you to think about is the possibility that the path dependency approach does accommodate the study of variation within Latin America. And the reason is because it's open to the possibility that all things are context specific. In fact, you could critique the theory by saying that it's too context specific. In fact, it's atheoretical. It's not sufficiently general to be a theory. It's underspecified and the categories are empty. What is a critical juncture and what does the work? Well, there's nothing there that does the work because it's all context specific. It's all under the hood, so to speak, and it requires studying the case. But at least that concept of a critical juncture leaves open the chance that critical junctures might take place at different times in different countries, and that some countries may have more critical junctures than others, that some countries may experience crises when others don't, that some countries may reset their institutions at moments when others do not. The approach does open itself up to that possibility, and the path dependency approach is somewhat salvaged for this reason, because Latin America presents us with such profound complexity and diversity that it's far too simplistic to approach the region as a set of countries with the same experience. That is just almost unacceptable in terms of the assumptions it makes about Latin American countries. Diversity is the region's treasure, and we should be theorizing and thinking in ways that accommodate that diversity. we can say what we will about the path dependency approach, but one of its strengths is that it does accommodate the study of diversity because it makes us open up to the different circumstances and different combinations of circumstances and the different sequences of events that take place in countries. And so this is what I want you to remember as we go forward. For all of its faults, if you're an individual who looks at Latin America and sees diversity and complexity, the path dependency approach looks at Latin America and sees the same thing, only it requires us to fill in some of the blanks and think a little bit about what we're observing and to kind of do some kind of case level theorizing where we develop an explanation for the case that does still use those concepts of path dependency in critical junctures. Adi says, our culture is different in those countries within Latin America, and those countries are open to different cultures. There are different cultures in Latin America, without a doubt. We do know that most Latin American countries share a colonial legacy or history with Portugal and Spain. And so for that reason, there's an important cultural affinity, if you will, or similarity. But it's not so essential that it weighs on the present entirely. We know that things have happened since colonialism, and so we shouldn't be stuck with those legacies completely. Okay, so we're going to move on and begin dealing with our institutional approaches. This is the third segment of our study of the theoretical section. And remember that we're using our knowledge of the empirical developments in Latin America and the historical process, really since independence, to understand and explore these theories. Because remember that these theories were developed really in response to those time periods. Now, as we continue, I want to encourage and reach out to you. Please involve yourself more in the discussion. I know that we're off to a bit of a slow start today, and it's a little bit abstract what we're discussing, but we need more engagement. And this means more from me and more from you. And so please join me and join us and be involved, and let's get the most out of this, because this is a chance for us to use the knowledge we already have and to have a pretty robust discussion. So let's not miss the opportunity. I'll do my best to create more space, but I want you to meet me in the middle. And so let's do that. Now, whenever we talk about an institutional approach to politics, the question that hangs over the entire discussion is always the same question. And that question is, what difference do institutions make? Now, this is a weighty question, and you may be asking, what are institutions in the first place? But institutionalists often have a chip on their shoulder because they feel compelled to really defend their perspective. It's because there's a lot of criticism leveled at institutionalist approaches, and sometimes it's unfair what they have to deal with. And one of those criticisms hovers around the question, do institutions matter? Do they matter? And it's kind of a joke because matter matters, and institutions are literally matter. We're talking about buildings, and so they do matter. But do they really matter? Do they really matter? Do they make an impact on politics? In Latin America, the question is the same. Do institutions impact politics, and to what extent? What kinds of institutions exert what kinds of impacts? There are questions about the strength or the weakness of institutions. There are questions about whether institutions are good or bad according to the standards that we create for evaluating them. But one thing that defines the Latin American experience, and that is important to mention as we get started, is a legacy and a history of institutionalization. These are countries with a rich tradition of creating rules, creating organizations, sort of instantiating these formal features of the political environment. And this has often gone hand in hand with a rich tradition of democracy. And so not only do institutions become important parts of the debate in Latin America, but they also have been central to politics from the very beginning because of this view of the merits of institutionalization. And so from the very beginning, we're faced with this important question. And that question becomes relevant because of those characteristics that are unique to Latin America, that tradition of institutionalization, and in more generally, that tradition of democratization and that democratic legacy. Now, in Latin America and elsewhere, any institutional approach carries with it a number of assumptions. Now, whenever we make assumptions, all we're doing is we're stating those things that have to be true in order for our theoretical propositions to be true. In other words, if institutions affect politics in X, Y, and Z ways, well, this is what else must be true for that to actually be the case. And so what we're really saying in the first place, when we make an institutional argument, is that institutions, understood as the organization of society and the rules of the game, are not easily changed, created, or destroyed. Now, this is so important. These things are viewed as invincible. Institutionalists view institutions as valued for their own sake and as things that persist and become static. And they become kind of like, just features or parts of the backdrop that are just always there. And they become so important in this way, like television or church or the activity of work, that they then shape the behavior of actors. Actors begin to design their strategies around those institutions themselves. They make decisions in response to them. They don't change them or alter them or destroy them. They adapt to them. And so this is the most important assumption of all, the third one, which is that institutions shape the behavior of political actors. Rules, constraints, and the responses to them of political actors guide the behavior of those actors during policymaking and during politics. And so I want you to really commit to that idea. These institutions are here and they're here to stay. They cannot be easily changed, they cannot be destroyed, and they cannot be replaced. Well, in that environment, actors have to respond and adapt to them in ways that permit them to pursue their goals. This is the essence of an institutional approach, finding out how actors respond to those institutions and then attributing outcomes to those institutions in the way that they mediate or structure behavior. And so let's really drill down here and identify the key theoretical proposition, the key claim, the testable claim that comes out of this debate. And that claim is that institutions are a determinant of political outcomes and a key factor in explaining cross-country differences in Latin America. So notice something. Differences is the key here. Why is that so important? Because institutions only become important and relevant when we can observe variations in them and how they then affect behavior differently. And so it becomes essential for us to notice what are some of those differences in Latin America? What are some of the variations across space and maybe across time that become important as causes? So an institutional approach, working with this approach and this logic, looks for the cause of outcomes in the organization of society and the rules of the game. Any Latin American country can be viewed through the lens of their institutional differences. But normally we look at multiple countries so that we can then observe those differences and those variations. Now, at this point, you should be asking, what are institutions? And how are they so important in Latin America? And when did they become important? Well, in a broad sense, institutions are the sets of rules, norms, and practices that organize and constitute social relations. So they are those humanly devised constraints, those features of the environment that we create and that then constrain us and structure our interactions. We'll talk about different examples of these institutions here in a moment, but our main focus in this class is political institutions, like the form of government, presidentialism or parliamentarism, the constraints on politicians and elites, the separation of powers and the extent to which power is concentrated in one branch or another. These are all important examples of institutions because as institutions, they shape the incentives and the choices that are available to different actors. And it shapes the distribution of political power as well. And so, for instance, in a presidential regime, the president and the legislature are independently elected. The president does not come from a legislative majority that is elected independently. In a parliamentary regime, by contrast, the prime minister, the formation of that government based on that prime minister depends on the election and the formation of a legislative majority. That affects the distribution of power. That means presidents, by and large, are stronger than our prime ministers. Latin American countries are largely presidential regimes. That's an important aspect of political institutions that then bears on the Latin American reality. Now, this is an example we'll go into detail on here in a moment, but I want you to be thinking about how institutions become important through their differences and through the variations that we can observe and how they distribute power differently. Now, these institutions can be both formal and informal. So on the formal side, we're talking about rules that appear in the Constitution, things that are codified, things that are taking the form of some law-like inscription, something that is written down. The legislature, or the judiciary or political parties, the constitutional structure, the legal sanction provided to labor and employer organizations, economic and financial institutions that are sanctioned by the state. All of these are codified rules, formal rules. These are things that are quite visible and usually have some material existence, right? You can go to the Congress building in Buenos Aires. You can go to the seat of the Supreme Court in the United States. You can go to the headquarters of political parties. You can go to where a constitution is kept under lock and key. You can go to the headquarters of labor and employer organizations and talk with their representatives. You can go to the headquarters of economic and financial institutions. These are organizations and entities that have formal power and have the capacity and do structure relationships between actors in society. These are formal institutions. But we also have informal institutions, and these are like the rules of conduct within a given community or a culture. It relates to how power is distributed in practice, not in law. And so when we talk about in practice, what we mean is the distribution of political power, the real distribution of power, the distribution of influence, as opposed to the distribution of legal authority or legal responsibility between institutions. What constitutes social norms? Notice that social norms, these are not things that we can touch like we can touch the brick of a building housing the headquarters of a political party. It's informal, right? It's more amorphous and elusive. But those social norms exert a similar influence in that they constrain us or they create limits on our behavior. We adapt to them and we respond to them. And our behavior is a calculated effort to sort of obey them, so to speak, while still getting what we want. This is the essence of an institutional approach, focusing on formal and informal institutions and how actors respond to them and how politics is shaped by those responses. So let's take an example that helps to clarify the difference between formal and informal institutions. And so in the United States, we have a presidential system. In Latin American countries, they have presidential systems. The constitutions in those systems are very similar. They have more in common than any other sets of systems in the world. Latin American democracies are very similar to the US. But the practice of politics in these countries could not be more different. In fact, it's quite striking when you look at the behavior of presidents, for example, and elites in Latin American countries versus in the United States. So historically, Latin American countries have been ruled by semi-authoritarian presidents, or presidents who are more strong-handed and strong-armed in the way that they rule. They often will maybe abuse power a little bit, or they'll push around the opposition. This is very different than, say, the United States, where traditionally, though presidents do have substantial powers of their own, they don't rule in a semi-authoritarian manner. They don't undermine competitiveness. Traditionally, historically, they don't engage in the same kinds of behaviors as, say, Alberto Fujimori or Hugo Chavez. Why? Well, it's because the informal institutions are different. Even though the formal institutions are the same, presidentialism, constitution, check and balance institutions, the informal distribution of power, the distribution of power in practice is very, very different. In Latin American countries, there is a legacy and a sort of practice or a social norm or a convention of strong executives who do rule in a semi-authoritarian way. And this informal distribution of power is so tied up with this kind of social convention and the kind of norm. This is the informal side of institutions. And this goes to show that even if the formal institutions are the same, the informal institutions can be very different. And that can mean differences in political outcomes. It can be the difference between staying democratic or transitioning from democratic to authoritarian rule in a country like Venezuela or Peru. It can be the difference between observing and protecting civil rights and liberties in a country like the United States at some moments in time, and limiting the right to vote or limiting those same rights and liberties in other places like, say, Guatemala in the 70s and the 80s. The point is that even though the institutions are the same, the informal institutions can be different. And that can be consequential for politics in ways that are very material, in ways that become apparent when we look and we compare the cases. Now, in this entire discussion, we've talked a lot about how institutions don't just determine outcomes, but become sources of development or growth in their own right. And we've kind of hinted at how we distinguish between different kinds of institutions. And this is where we begin to bring in a distinction between what's sometimes referred to as good and bad institutions. Now, this is a kind of language that I don't particularly like because it's more nuanced than this. But in general, this distinction highlights some of the differences between the effects of different institutions. And so, on the one hand, those good institutions or those social conventions, those standard operating procedures, et cetera, that are good, those are the ones that tend to disperse power more widely, that tend to represent interests, that mediate conflicts between different groups, that expand political participation and representation, and that strengthen transparency and accountability. These are all things that we kind of aspire to. And these are outcomes produced by institutions that we would be considered good. Now, this is just a convenient distinction that we make for the purpose of trying to better evaluate some of the institutions in the Latin American reality. On the other hand, we have the bad institutions. Those are ones that tend to concentrate power, they ignore interests, they tend to aggravate conflicts, they tend to restrict political participation and representation, and they tend to undermine transparency and accountability. And so you may wonder, well, what is a bad institution? Can you give me an example? Can you give me an example of a good institution? Is democracy a good institution? Democracy is certainly an institution, but a better way of asking it might be, are there different forms of democratic government that might be more good or less good, or more bad or less bad? Are there different types of democratic or electoral institutions that may be more favorable or less favorable to democracy? This is the kind of set of questions that we want to ask. And this brings us then to some of the institutional variation in Latin America and some of the important differences that do show themselves and that do potentially become important to politics. And so those include differences between democracy and dictatorship. They include differences between the constraints on politicians and elites in some countries and those in other countries. Say in some countries, presidential powers are quite well established and extensive. In other countries, they're more restricted and they're more confining. There are also differences in terms of the electoral rules and the way votes are counted and the way that interests are represented by the electoral system. Some systems are majoritarian. Some systems are more proportional representation. There are differences in terms of the legal systems. And then finally, there are differences in terms of corruption and the norms around corruption. For example, in some countries, historically at least, it's been normalized to use the state apparatus to finance the activities of political parties and to do so covertly. That's an example of institutionalized corruption in a place like Argentina, Bolivia, Venezuela, places where corruption may have been viewed very differently than in places like, say, Uruguay or Chile. These are all examples of differences across Latin American countries. These differences matter greatly to institutionalists because remember that for them, these institutions persist and become valued for their own sake. It might be obvious to you that corruption is not good, but in the system itself that is characterized by corruption, it becomes a convention and a way of doing business. It becomes an operating procedure. And in that regard, it becomes valued for its own sake. And so these are critical informal and formal institutions that do become important in Latin America. So let's take a look at some of them. So first and foremost, we've already established that there is a clear difference between democratic regimes somewhere in the region and dictatorships elsewhere in the region. So we've established that Bolivia, Guatemala, and Nicaragua and Venezuela can more or less be categorized as authoritarian regimes because they are either under the control of unelected governments or because competitiveness and free and fair elections have been so tainted that the government can no longer be said to be democratically elected. We know that the other 18 countries in our 18 country sample, the other 14, essentially countries outside of the Caribbean, we know that those countries are still democratic. Now, this is not an insignificant difference for an institutionalist. This is vitally important. Well, how does it become important? Well, an institutionalist might ask, for example, are dictatorships more corrupt than democracies? Latin America has a legacy of corruption. How does the transition from democratic to authoritarian rule affect the struggle to combat corruption and reduce corruption? They might also ask, do democratic regimes perform better economically than dictatorships? Do democratic regimes hold out more promise for the development of social classes like the indigenous? Do they hold out more promise for things like youth employment? Do they hold out more promise for things like responding to COVID-19 effectively and managing the crisis? These are all examples of an institutional analysis that could be done by drawing a distinction between those authoritarian and those democratic governments in Latin America. And so this distinction then is not unimportant. And I want you to be open to the possibility that those distinctions do matter a great deal. And even if many Latin American democracies are semi-authoritarian, there's a clear difference between a full-blown authoritarian regime like what exists in Venezuela and a semi-authoritarian one like what exists in Brazil. Although we should be equally concerned about declines in Brazil. But the point is that these variations matter because they then exert an influence of their own and help to explain differences between the countries. Another important difference relates to presidential powers. Now, Latin American democracies are characterized almost above all by relatively strong executives. That is, presidents who have significant powers to introduce legislation, veto legislation, react to the activities of the legislature itself, and so on and so forth. And so what I have here are presidential powers in 2005. What you'll notice, though, is that even though there are some very, very powerful executives here on this side of things, we actually have a lot of variation. Countries like Paraguay, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica being one of the most robust democracies in Latin America, don't have very strong executives compared to countries like Chile and Brazil. In a country like Chile, presidents have both robust proactive powers where they can introduce legislation, but they also have very strong reactive powers where they can veto legislation or prevent the moving forward of bills. And their overall legislative powers are extensive as well. Same in Brazil, and more or less the same in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, with some exceptions. Now, these differences matter a great deal. Why does it matter, for instance, that a president can introduce legislation exclusively or can veto or prevent the moving of legislation in the Congress? Well, it matters because it can affect the prospects for democratic survival. What if that president loses the support of key groups well before the election because they don't have to pass the legislative agenda of a dominant party in the Congress that isn't the same party as their own? Who's to stop these institutions from finding themselves in gridlock because presidents overstep their boundaries and use their powers to behave in ways that could be abusive or could crowd out or kind of take away from the role of the legislature? And then from the point of view of the president himself or herself and her agenda, how do presidential powers affect their ability to enact their agenda? And how does that in turn affect their ability to become reelected? And does all of this then affect the survival of the democracy because it affects the satisfaction of voters with parties and with the president and with the responsiveness of parties and the president? You can see as we begin to unpeel the layers that there's more and more to the story than just some minor institutional differences from country to country. In fact, there really is a whole story about how institutions affect behavior and then how behavior produces consequences that can be more or less favorable to the survival of democracy. And what I want to talk with you about here in a moment is how presidentialism in Latin America and elsewhere might actually contain the seeds of its own destruction, precisely because these pronounced presidential powers, combined with the independent survival of the president and the legislature, create the possibility of gridlock and breakdown and crisis. And so this brings us to probably the most important consideration of all. And this is whether or not presidentialism is a bad institution. Now, when it comes to debating Latin American democracy in the forms of government in Latin America, there's not much of a debate about whether we should choose presidentialism or parliamentarism. The reason is because, to a certain degree, these countries are stuck with presidentialism. Barring some extraordinary circumstance, it is unlikely that they would change to a parliamentary system. And so the debate isn't about choosing between the two, it's about whether or not presidentialism by itself represents a threat to the survival of Latin American democracy. Now, some people think that it does. Some believe that presidentialism undermines democracy in Latin America and elsewhere. And the reason is as follows. So, in a presidential election, the head of government and the head of state are fused. And there's a separate election for the president and the legislature. We call this independent survival. The president is not elected or nominated by a majority within the Congress. That president is directly elected by the people for a fixed term, in the same way that the legislators themselves are directly elected by the people for a fixed term. Now, this direct election and this independent survival, as we call it, becomes very, very important. Because the president is elected directly by the voters, they don't need to cooperate with the legislature for them to stay in power. Because if they lose the support of that legislature, nothing happens to their survival. They can just wait until the next election and still get reelected. What this means then is that there's sort of a built-in incentive or possibility of breakdown or crisis or gridlock where the executive may not cooperate with the legislature and vice versa. Now, 15 of the 28 presidential systems in the world are in Latin America, and most of those 15 are in our 18-country sample of countries that share a colonial legacy with Portugal or Spain. And so presidentialism is the dominant form of government in Latin America. The question then becomes, is the risk of gridlock overblown? Or are Latin American democracies on the brink because of this institutional feature? Is it really the case that Latin American democracies contain the seeds of their own destruction because of this independent survival characteristic of presidentialism? Or are we missing some other reasons that presidents have to cooperate with legislatures or vice versa that could help to manage this possible shortcoming or help us to get away from that? And as we move forward, I want you to keep that in mind, but let's juxtapose presidentialism with parliamentarism. So parliamentarism is sometimes thought of as an example of a good institution compared to presidentialism. Now, you've got two heads or two positions, a head of government and a head of state. The head of government is not chosen directly by the voters, but selected by the legislature. So the existence of that head of government depends on a legislative majority to exist. The cabinet is a collegial body, which means that the winner-take-all logic does not apply. And normally the cabinet will resemble the composition of the majority that elected that prime minister or that head of government. And moreover, that government It needs the confidence of the parliament to survive. And it can fall through a motion of non-confidence. Now, what that means is that there's no independent survival. There's dependent survival. The head of government, in the form of the prime minister, depends on maintaining the support of a legislative majority to survive. That gives them an incentive to cooperate with the parliament and to cooperate with the Congress in a way that could produce a more sustainable, a more solidified sort of democratic process. And so the debate then goes like this. Presidents rule in an undemocratic manner, and this mixes with the realities of independent survival to trigger crises. Now, there are two problems according to this view. The first problem in Latin America and elsewhere is that the fixed term of the president leads to crises when a leader loses the support of key groups well before an election. And then secondarily, presidential governments also have recurring problems in selecting successors because the same reasons that the incumbent government lost support can also make it difficult to select a successor. Parliamentarism, on the other hand, is more flexible because the head of government depends on a legislative majority to exist. And new elections in the formation of a new government, in turn, are triggered by a vote of no confidence by the legislature. Now, Juan Linz, who is our main thinker for this set of approaches, said that Latin American countries erred in choosing presidentialism for this set of reasons, because they chose a system that is prone to crisis and that will also struggle to replace those chief executives who do lose the support of key groups well before an election. And Juan Linz would point to examples like Argentina in the late 1980s, when Raul Alfonsín proved unable to manage the economic crisis and lost both the support of political parties that weren't his own, as well as key labor and other groups. Now, not only was it hard for Raul Alfonsín to stay in office, but he had to leave office early. And he was replaced by Carlos Menem, who won the election. But that was an agonizing election where traditional parties were badly affected by the crisis. Menem won an electoral mandate, but the whole point of this is that it was a challenging sequence of events, and Alfonsín's term had to be brought to an end prematurely, precisely because he had lost the support of key groups. Juan Linz would seem to be right if we looked at the Argentine experience and read that as an example of what else could happen in Latin America. But one thing Latin America has shown to be false about Juan Linz's idea is that presidents are just as capable as prime ministers of assembling coalitions. Even though they are independently elected, their survival is affected by their ability to pass their legislative agenda. And that requires assembling a multi-party coalition. And so Linz underestimated the capacity of presidents to put together coalitions to pass their bills. In countries like Brazil, almost never have presidents had a majority. Instead, they've assembled coalitions and they've been able to pass a majority of their bills, almost to the same degree of success as parliamentary systems. And so the debate is an important one because it makes us think about the potential for conflict inherent in presidentialism. It makes us think about the ways that the choices of institutions can affect the survival of democracy. And this brings us to the most important question of all. That question is, will the choice of institutions affect the prospects for the survival of emerging democracies in Latin America? And what are those choices? what choices are countries making that will either send them down one path or the other? We're kind of reverting to the path dependency approach, aren't we? The key question is, what is within reach? What are they choosing between? And what are the consequences of those choices? How will those choices affect politics? How will they affect democratic survival? And again, I want you to think about questions like the choice of presidentialism, the choice of electoral system, the choice about what kinds of powers or liberties party leaders will have in, say, proportional representation races where they can decide for themselves what party stalwarts will fill roles when votes are counted, or whether voters will themselves elect those legislators directly. That's the difference between open and closed list proportional representation. That's just one example. There are other examples that I gave you between democracy and dictatorship, differences in terms of electoral institutions, and so on and so forth. We're not quite done with institutions. We'll have a little bit more to say next week, or excuse me, on Wednesday, I'm sorry, before we get started on our next topic. But this does conclude our discussion for today. I'm going to go ahead and let you go, and I'm going to stop recording. I'll stick around and take questions or comments if you have them. Otherwise, you're free to go.